Hello, I'm Noel Hacegaba, Chief Operating Officer at the Port of Long Beach. Welcome to Supply Chain Insight, where we discuss the latest news, issues, and trends in the supply chain with top industry leaders, experts, and influencers. Our objective is to bring you the insight you need to help keep your cargo moving. Today's business executives expect a lot from their supply chains: efficiency, velocity, flexibility, cost management, and operational excellence. Supply Chain Insight brings a supply chain to you, one segment at a time, to explore new approaches and innovative solutions that will help you and the Port of Long Beach deliver greater value to our customers and partners. In today's episode, we will hear from one of retail industry's most influential voices, Matt Priest, President and CEO of the Footwear Distributors Retailers Association. FDRA is the largest and most active footwear association in the United States. As President and CEO, Matt manages FDRA's day-to-day operations, and he also directs the operations of the Fashion Footwear Association of New York. Now, before joining FDRA, Matt served as Senior Advisor to Commerce Secretary Carlos Gutierrez and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Textiles and Apparel at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Matt was also Chairman of the Committee for the Implementation of Textile Agreements, and he previously served as Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Import Administration at the Commerce Department, where he advised Assistant Secretary on textiles and trade issues. And before that, Matt was a Legislative Director for Representative Sue Myrick of North Carolina, where he was an advisor in the areas of textiles, trade, and economic development. Matt earned his BA in Political Science from North Carolina State University, and he lives in Northern Virginia with his wife and 3 daughters. Matt, welcome to Supply Chain Insight. We are delighted to have you on today. You and your members are right in the middle of one of the most challenging periods facing retail and footwear, and you have been an effective voice educating the public and policymakers on the impact of shifting trade policies and tariffs on the supply chain and the broader economy. And I know that our viewing audience will benefit immensely from your insights today. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We've been friends for a long time, so thank you for allowing me to come on and talk trade and imports and all the fun stuff we're going through.
Now, for those who may not be familiar with FDRA, Matt, tell us who you are, who you represent, and what you do to keep the supply chain going.
Yeah, happy to. So we are an 81-year-old organization. We're based in Washington, D.C. We represent 97% of the industry, and our members are the who's who of the footwear space, right? So it's Nike and Adidas and Under Armour and Dick's Sporting Goods, Target, Walmart, all the way down to family importers, third-generation family importers, and everyone in between. And our job is to be an advocate for the industry. We do a whole slew of different things, but right now, advocacy is like the top benefit members are getting from us right now, and so that's who we are. We're a 501c6 trade association, like the Long Beach Chamber of Commerce or the National Football League, and we probably fall somewhere in between those two. And so we're proud to be the leading, kind of the tip of the spear as it relates to the footwear industry here in the United States.
Well, thanks for that background. And by the way, you look great for 81, at least the FDRA. So the footwear industry.
All my vitamins. So.
Yeah, that's right. Take your vitamins. So the footwear industry is massive. I mean, give us a sense of the market. How many shoes are imported each year into the United States, and how many of them are purchased and consumed?
Yeah, it is a massive market. People get blown away by these statistics, but we import anywhere between 2 to 3 billion pairs every single year. That's over 7 pairs of shoes for every single person in this country. And we're about $120 billion industry annually. So we have the highest per capita consumption rate for any country in the world as it relates to shoes and footwear. And 99% of our shoes are imported, and a vast majority of those come through your port there in Southern California. And so the importance of our partnership with the Port of Long Beach is so critical to this industry. And so it lets you know, like 340 million Americans and visitors alike and immigrants alike all need footwear. And so we're one of those industries that is so prevalent. It's the top, I should say top of mind, everybody, because it's at the bottom of your feet, but you get the point. And that's what makes us proud to represent these companies, because we provide great functional footwear, fashionable footwear, hopefully price competitive footwear for everyone here in this country.
That is a massive number, Matt. And I remember when the shipping lines started upsizing their vessels, we used shoes to illustrate just how much capacity these 18,000 TEU ships carried. For example, when we ran the numbers, we estimated that an 18,000 TEU vessel had the capacity to store about 73 million pairs of shoes.
Oh my God.
I mean, just one ship. So it would take many, many of those ships to get to the over 1 billion that we import.
Actually, a lot less ships than I thought. So that is unbelievable.
And some people would still probably say it's not enough, right? Those who collect shoes.
Never enough shoes. I mean, that's a given, right? So at least in my industry.
So we're going to talk about trade and trade policy and tariffs in a moment, but it's worth pointing out that in recent years, in spite of historically high inflation and the announcement of new tariffs, the footwear market has remained strong. Thanks to the resilience of the American consumer, everyone still continues to buy shoes, as you pointed out, about 6 to 7 pairs per person who lives here in the United States. In fact, footwear spending, according to your latest report, was up about 3.1% for the month of June, reaching a seasonally adjusted $117 billion. And that's a record month. So what do you attribute this to, and what's the story behind these numbers?
Yeah, so Noel, there's been so many kind of once in a lifetime variables impacting our economy, the shoe economy, as we like to call it. I mean, it's like pun city when you work in the footwear industry, but the shoe economy, as we call it, there's been so many variables since 2020 that are really hard to benchmark against. And I know you have the same issue there at the port as well with your own statistics. And so when you have these both kind of natural and artificial variables impacting the supply chain and consumers' ability to buy footwear vis-a-vis massive stimulus or a pandemic or now tariff policy, it's hard to kind of pin down what is driving the consumer and what's motivating the consumer. A lot of what we're seeing right now in the back to school time period, which we find ourselves in, is this kind of front loading of the back to school purchasing because the importers front loaded the imports coming in because of their concern around tariffs. And so the consumer, we're always looking for what's the kind of mentality or the psychology around how consumers are behaving. And on our own surveys that we have in partnership with Alex Partners, as well as like the National Retail Federation has pointed this out, back to school shoppers are buying way earlier than they normally do because they're concerned about tariffs. So at the end of the day, what we find is that we trust our consumers. They're way smarter than I think media gives them credit for. They know tariffs are coming. They know they drive up prices, and they're adjusting their purchasing cadence to kind of deal with that. And so that's what we've seen to date. And Lord knows what's coming around the corner in the rest of 25 and 2026. But I think that we'll continue to, as long as the consumer's there and has discretionary income, we'll be selling them shoes as many as we can.
You know, that's very interesting, and it sounds like it's part of the broader, what I call the the resiliency of the American consumer, right? In spite of all the headwinds, the American consumer continues to buy, and like you said, they are smarter than most people give them credit for. So this year has been a roller coaster ride between retaliatory tariffs, the ongoing negotiations with China. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market. You could say we've all been waiting for the other shoe to drop, no pun intended.
Yep.
But what are you seeing, and what are you hearing from your members?
Yeah, so if you look at the second quarter, if you look at all of the conference calls around publicly traded companies in the second quarter, the results, the earnings calls, I think 84%. There's like 450 companies that report out in a quarter. I think. Don't quote me on that. That's ballpark. 84% of those calls said the word uncertain. And so that is the topic du jour. That is what we're all dealing with. And so when you think about that, our members are very uncertain. And so what we've tried to do as an association to best represent them is to be sure that we're constantly in their faces with information and being relevant and just driving as much information analysis as we can based on our expertise, being policymakers ourselves over the years. A number on our team have been in those positions, as well as being here in Washington, D.C., close to the action, as well as being on cleared advisory committees and getting, maybe some intel before it leaks out of the Wall Street Journal kind of stuff. Yeah. And so those are the ways in which we're trying to make sure that in this environment, our members, as they're dealing with uncertainty, they at least have an association that's got their back and is feeding them as much information as possible, even if it's not good news. I will say there was a point just a few weeks ago that I finally said to our members, we had an event in New York, and I basically said, put your costing pencils down, just wait. The scenario plans have their own scenario plans at this point. So it's just too much to try to ascertain where you should cost your goods until you know where all the countries and their duty rates, and we're still figuring that out right now, which makes it really difficult to be in their position. But some of it for us is like so a little bit tough love. Like, all right, okay, this is not going away. We can't like freak out with every True Social post and every pronouncement coming out of Washington D.C. And so we have to really help our members relax, take a breath. You've got wisdom from COVID. You've got wisdom from the supply chain, kind of the run on goods that happened just after COVID that impacted you all so directly. Let's continue to lean on our guts and our wisdom and our knowledge to make the best decisions we can, and then know that you can adjust if you need to. And so there's been a lot of coaching in that regard, and trying to take complex terms and make them in more digestible layman's terms so that people feel a little bit better about where we're headed, even if it's not crystal clear at this point.
Well, you're certainly doing a great job, Matt, and wise advice, right, to all your members and those listening. You don't want to overreact, right? Yep. Here at the Port of Long Beach, for calendar year 2025, we've been busier than ever. In fact, this follows a record year in calendar year 2024. Between June of 2024, April of 2025, we saw 11 consecutive months of year-over-year container volume growth. Wow. And we saw the first dip in May and a sharper dip in June. And we're about to release our numbers for July, and it's going to go up again, thankfully. But that said, for the first half of 2025, we're still 10.6% ahead of last year, which was a record. In fact, Long Beach led the nation in container volumes between January and April. And the question for you is, does that line up with what you're seeing in footwear shipments? Because the talk late last year and throughout this year has been, the negative impact of tariffs and how volumes were going to cause this doom and gloom. But so far, we've seen the opposite.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And there's been a lot of public reporting, and obviously the president and his team are pointing to some of these statistics as a reason for folks not to freak out. And I never want to be Pollyannish. I always want to make sure that we're calling balls and strikes in a fair way and a respectful way. And so we kind of do gut checks as well. Like, okay, what are we missing here? We know that tariffs have gone up exponentially and historically. I hear and I talk to our members every day, all day long. And I've heard some just terrible stories of will we survive or not kind of questions. When there's a 145% tariff on goods out of China, that's an embargo. And we had some duties were pushing 200% coming out of China. And so you ask yourself, you're a small family importer, you're selling to Walmart, Target, and the big retailers, but you're still privately held small family importer. Will we survive? Because it's going to cost us $1.5 million in duties to bring in $1 million worth of goods every month. No, we're not going to survive if that's how if the status quo continues. And so looking at the data, trying to understand where we're headed and trying to understand how much of this impact the retailers and the brands have absorbed at this point is the big question. And so that's why we're a little nervous about back half of the year. Yeah. But to your point, right now, our costs are flat through June. That doesn't mean they're not about to go up. I think right now, almost 80% of our members now have tariff product in the marketplace starting in July and August. So I think things are coming, and there's a delayed impact. But it also just shows you, I think, the wisdom of the industry that they're preparing, right? Because one of the things we learned in the pendulum kind of back and forth on inventory is that we had too much inventory, then we didn't have enough, and then inventory is an art. It is not, as much as we want it to be a science, inventory management, it is an art. You're not always going to get it right. And so I think right now there's a lot of wisdom we learned in the COVID years, Noel, that we're now kind of discharging in the tariff years, because I can tell you time and time again, our members have said, we had a war room in the COVID years and we just propped it back up and it's all hands on deck and we're working through it. So I'm pleased by those numbers. I don't want anyone ever to think that we want things to go south. But I can tell you, our duty bill is going to go from $3 billion as an industry annually to $5 billion in 1 year. Someone's going to pay that. Yeah. And when you have those added costs, that's going to drive down capital investment, employment, and it's going to drive up prices. So that's what we're concerned about long term, even if the short term data right now is pointing to positive outcomes.
Yeah. It's a good analogy. You continue to refer to the supply chain crisis, pandemic induced, and there were a lot of lessons learned. As a matter of fact, I call the fact that we all came together as an industry to navigate the supply chain crisis. One of the reasons why even today, in spite of record cargo volumes, you're seeing no congestion, no backlogs, no delays. Right. Certainly speaking for Southern California, I call that the secret sauce, how we all learn to work better together. And like you said, not get too bent out of shape on the numbers, recognizing that you have to be nimble and flexible. So right. Here's the question of the hour, right? What is your outlook for the rest of the year, calendar year 2025?
Yeah, so we're trying to, again, not be Pollyannish, but we are concerned. So when we looked at actual kind of numbers relative to the first half of the year, we have a consumer survey. We've done a number of consumer surveys this year. We've even surveyed the president's supporters on tariffs and how they feel about tariffs. And spoiler alert, they don't like tariffs, particularly on shoes, even if they think they're more broadly important geopolitically, and we can respect that. But around the inauguration, we started to see our own internal sales numbers that we track weekly, that consumers were spooked. And they were spooked by tariffs, and because it goes back to that knowledge and wisdom of the consumer. And so what we have found is that, our internal sales numbers are okay. They're not the greatest. It depends on the sector you're in and the segment of the industry that you participate in, as how you're feeling about the consumer right now and their purchasing power. But to date, our prices haven't gone up and our consumers still a little uneasy. So as we surveyed them, we talked to them, front loading on their own budgets and their own time, the back to school purchasing. What will holiday look like? Are they buying product now that they would have ultimately bought in the fall and heading into holiday that they're going to hold off and not buy moving forward? And kind of what unemployment does, all those critical numbers, that what does that all do and how does the consumer feel about it? And then lastly, I'll say in July, we saw a record number of searches in Google for footwear inflation. And so when you think about, okay, as a consumer going out there looking to see what's going on relative to pricing for their shoes, and they're using Google to do it, how's that, again, are they confident? And so it's going to be a mixed bag. I think there are going to be some will be fine and they'll continue to excel. But, I think we'll have, if we're lucky, we'll have probably a flat to up a point or two year. And if that's what it boils down to, then that's probably good. The longer term question, Noel, is around the prices and will they go up, and how long our retailers and brands can hold on to those added costs without passing them on to the consumer, and that's to be determined.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that, Matt, because like you said, there's no science, right? It's more art than anything else. And I can tell you that here in Long Beach, at the Port of Long Beach, we expect to end the calendar year flat or just above flat, right? So what you're projecting is really what we're projecting as well. Let's talk about something else that has emerged in recent years, the shifting in sourcing. So do you expect more sourcing from Southeast Asia and other regions as more shippers employ what has been called the China Plus One strategy?
Yeah, this is a question we unpack all the time because it's top of mind for us critically right now. Yeah. So when I started this job in 2009, we were 88% of our volume was from China.
Wow.
And people were like, 88%? My goodness gracious. And so now we're 52%, 51, 52. In fact, this year we'll have a 30-year low on our reliance on China as it relates to footwear. Of course, a lot of that's artificially driven by the tariff policy, but nevertheless, we have been diversifying out of China actually even before the president's first term. It was something, that China Plus One strategy that you mentioned was something top of mind for our members. We can't have all of our footwear eggs in the China basket. And a lot of what drove us away from China was market-based. China was rising, middle class was rising, worker shortages, less interest in working in low production facilities. They wanted to work in services or in higher production facilities, technology, et cetera. And so we were moving into Vietnam pretty rapidly. Obviously, in the president's first term and now in his second term, those plans have kind of put our movement, have poured an accelerant on our need to diversify. The challenge right now is that we don't know, it's kind of my prior point, put your costing pencils down. We don't know what the rates will ultimately be in the long term. I mean, it feels like, with Vietnam now, there's a 20% tariff on top of 20%. So a sneaker is a 40% tariff out of Vietnam to the U.S. market. That's high, but there's really not a place to run to try to capture that back. And so we're still waiting for some of the details, the agreements that are being negotiated. None of these agreements are finalized. And once we have those, I think we'll have more confidence in shifting. But I can tell you, we've had people shift to India and Brazil, and now we have these added tariffs on both countries. that are now 50%. So that's on top of, again, I go back to a sneaker. Now you have a 70% sneaker coming out of India or Brazil. That's not competitive. And so just when you thought you were okay,
Yeah.
because the administration asked us to leave China, we've done that, and then we get hit over the head in a new market. And that's why right now, that's probably the number one question about what's our strategy going to be? Where do we take our lumps? Where do we invest and just go ahead and go for it, even if it's going to be uncertain for a while? And we're dealing with that every single day. I have these conversations every single day because of the uncertainty of the landscape of what sourcing will look like even a year from now.
Yeah. In recent years, Mexico has emerged as a nearshoring hub. Are you seeing any activity along these lines in the retail and footwear sector more broadly?
Mexico has always been interesting to us because it's so close. We have the USMCA, NAFTA prior to that. There's a pretty onerous rule of origin. I won't bore
Yeah.
viewers with the technicalities of it, but it makes the flexibility sourcing out of Mexico can be a challenge. The other challenge is the president's kind of continued focus on migration and fentanyl, which creates these tariff pressure points that create, again, uncertainty, even if you're sourcing with your neighbor. And so while I think we always acknowledge Mexico's importance in the mosaic of opportunities that our importers have when it comes to sourcing product, they haven't kind of leapt ahead. They're still top 10 supplier of the U.S. market, but they haven't cracked the top 5 in a long time. And so we'll see kind of where the dust settles on some of these tariffs, and it could be more price competitive to actually go to Mexico. We have the USMCA review, the statutory review next year. Will they make tweaks where it makes it more flexible to source out of Mexico? I won't hold my breath, but that might be an opportunity for us to even make it more advantageous for us to source there from our neighbor to the south. And the good folks in Leon, Mexico, will always be important to us as suppliers to our market, and we'll continue to work with them as needed.
So with everything that we've discussed, Matt, and that you've offered, right, what guidance do you give your members, and what advice do you have for the shippers who are listening to this right now?
I think it's what we've already touched on, right? It's not to kind of freak out with each movement. The other advice is like the world doesn't revolve around you and your industry, and I have to tell this to myself in the mirror, and I have to tell it to our members because at the end of the day, the president of the United States has to govern, no matter who it is, and he and maybe at some point she will have to make decisions that are important in their minds to the agenda that they brought and they've been elected to do. And so while we may not understand why there has to be another 25% tariff on India, and why I don't think that ultimately is going to help lower costs for consumers, which the president was elected on, there's a broader geopolitical calculation that doesn't necessarily always revolve around shoes. In fact, because of our advocacy, this is probably my 103rd interview since January 20th. Our comms people keep track of it, which makes me feel very tired when I hear that number. But because of the work we've done in the marketplace, someone even asked the president, a reporter asked the president, you want to make sneakers here? And he's like, no, we're not looking to make sneakers. We want to make high tech and AI and do those kinds of things. And we agree with the president. And so our hope is at some point, the rhetoric lines up with the policy and we get some relief. But in the meantime, my advice to everybody is just take a chill pill. There's probably a tariff now on chill pills as they've been imported, but take a chill pill and just one step at a time and stick to your core, stick to your gut, trust your gut. You've been importing shoes for a lot of our folks for a long, long time. Just go with, you're not always gonna kind of make the right decision in this environment. No one is. So just go with your gut, lean on your instincts, and trust your teams and your partners like the Port of Long Beach to get you through it. And I think you'll be fine.
Well, as always, great sage advice, Matt. So I had the pleasure of being a guest on one of your podcasts some time ago, and you have a tradition of asking your guests what shoe they're sporting on that day. So I thought we would return the favor and ask you, what shoe are you sporting today?
Well, in honor of having a conversation with you in the Port of Long Beach, I had to pick a California company. I had to pick a Southern California company. I had to pick a California resident who is iconic. And so I will do show and tell because that's what we do in the shoe industry. I am wearing Skechers slip-ons, the Snoop Dogg version. So Snoop Dogg, there he is right there. He has become an icon in the industry for us. He has like 15 different careers going at once. So for us, I thought, you know what? I'm going to be talking to you. I got to sport something that's iconic for for California, and so what better than a Skechers Snoop Dogg shoe? It's perfect for summer. Slip it on, slip it off, and off you go.
And I'm sure you wear it well. And just for our audience, Snoop Dogg is actually from Long Beach. So not only did you get the right state and the right region, you got the right city. So Matt, thanks again for joining me on Supply Chain Insight. As always, your insights and perspectives were extremely helpful. To our valued audience, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon for another episode of Supply Chain Insight, brought to you by the Port of Choice, the Port of Long Beach.